Well, welcome tonight to our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm glad that you're here tonight with us, and I'm really glad that you folks who have been in our Sunday services have been there. We've had a good time there with each other, worshiping the Lord and looking into His Word. As we've looked at Samson and his early life, and we'll look at the continuation of that as we move forward. But we're going to skip a week this week because we're honored, honestly, to have Mark Buxton, who is a missionary from the Philippines, who we provide some support for each month. And he's going to come on Sunday morning at 10:30 to give us an update and to share with us some information about the Philippines, what's going on there in terms of how the virus is going, what his ministry there looks like in spite of the virus that's there, and to also give us an opportunity to partner with him in ministry through prayer and financially. So I just ask that you sign up, register to come and be with us on Sunday morning. We'll start our personal worship and reflection time at about 10:15. And I was excited this past Sunday. Everybody was there at 10:15, and you can sing if you want to or not sing, but we are all wearing masks, and God has been good to us through this season in the life of the United States, our church, and other things. And also, then at 10:30, right on the dot, we'll start with our live stream, and we'll push that out to folks. But also, those of you who are there, we'll hear Mark speak at 10:30. And we'll go from there. So I look forward to having him here with us, and part of this whole thing about ministry is trying to help get the word out, right? The gospel to as many people as we can, and then train them to serve Him, sort of to go on the quote of the pledge to the Awana flag. So we're going to enjoy our time on Sunday with Mark, and hopefully you will be able to be a part of that. So tonight we're going to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 7 through 16. And this kind of closes out chapter 4. Chapter 3, you remember, did all of there's a time for, to weep, to mourn, to laugh, to dance, to throw stones, to gather stones, and all the other things that Solomon speaks of there. But here, finishing up chapter 4, we see that he again speaks of the futility or the vanity of really life. And as he begins, as he has done before, he says that he looks at all of the vanity under the sun. So if you look in verse 7, is where we'll begin. He says, "Then I looked again at vanity under the sun." Now, again, he uses the word vanity over and over and over again. He uses the term sun, under the sun, over and over and over again. And so when Solomon says this, he says, I look at all of the useless, non-valuable things that happen under the sun, right? So anything that's happening on earth, it's almost like Solomon is perched on a balcony and he's looking over and looking at all of the workings of man that are going on, and he says they're all vanity. They're useless. They don't make any sense, and they really have no real purpose, no eternal purpose. So as we look at this, we see that he says there was a certain man This is in verse 8. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked this question, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? And Solomon says, this too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. So the first part of this last section of chapter 4 deals with the idea of isolation. And so he says this, there was a certain man without a dependent. No son, no brother, no one extra in the house to help. And so he was doing all of the labor in isolation, basically. And he says there was no end to all his labor, and his eyes were not satisfied with the riches that he had. So understand this. It says that he worked and worked and worked and worked because he had to have stuff, but even though he had to have stuff, that stuff did not satisfy him. And so it says that his eyes were not satisfied with the riches. Does that ever happen to you where you think you want something? You go out and you buy it, you purchase it, you get it home, and you look around and you're like, man, I'd like to have something else. I want that next thing. So I'm not satisfied with just this, but I want this. I'm not satisfied with just a Chromebook. I want to get an iPad Pro with the 12 cameras in the back, right? So you're saying that I'm not satisfied with just where I am and who I am. I need more. And Solomon here says that is vanity. He says that too is vanity. He says, look, I've never even asked for whom I am laboring or depriving myself of pleasure. He can't even enjoy the things that he has because he's too tired and worn out because of all the work that he's doing. Now, he's a workhorse, right? I mean, he works all the time and he's laboring all the time. But even though he's working all the time and laboring all the time, he can't even enjoy the stuff he's got. This is a problem. Solomon says, this is vanity. It's useless. And it's a grievous task. Basically, Solomon here is saying that human endeavors, the human task under the sun is basically useless. It's grievous. And the idea of isolation even makes it worse. It's that inability to secure happiness in our lives. And if you look back, I mean, he talks about in chapter 2 and 3 the idea of work and how it's not all what it's wrapped up to be. So he continues on in verse 9. So if you think about it, verse 7 dealt with the idea of isolation. Verse 9 now begins with the idea of companionship. All right? So he begins to talk about 3 areas of companionship. All right? The first area is in verse 9 where he says, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good return for their labor. So when you're thinking about the idea of doing work, when you're thinking about the idea of laboring, what Solomon here says is that the labor of 2 produces far more than just the labor of 1 person. So it seems like, well, that's a good thing, right? And he's trying to say that the idea of isolationism means that you're having to work so hard you can't even enjoy the things that you have under the sun, all of this. But he says that two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with marriage. This just has something to do with companionship. This has something to do with friendship. It has something to do with people working together. So two working together is much better than just one working together, right? Because one can't work together. One works in isolation. So he says the first thing that this one verse talks about is about the return for their labor in verse 9. He says the return for their labor is good. They're able to accomplish more with two. The second part of this is in verse 10. He says, for if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. So now he's not talking here about the idea of sinning. You may have heard people preach through Ecclesiastes before, and when you read the word fall, it all of a sudden becomes allegorical, right? And people say, well, if it says fall, that must mean that it must mean falling into sin, right? But that's not what it means. It simply means, and if you're familiar with, and you could probably imagine, the streets around Palestine, they were rocky. They were, it was rough. They didn't have paving machines and all this kind of thing. They were rough and rocky. And slippery, if you've tried to walk up a small hill where there are rocks, your feet will slip and, out from underneath you. They would me, and then I would fall. That's exactly what this verse 10 is picturing. The idea that someone is on a walk, the two are together, one of them falls, and the other will lift up his companion. So not only do they have a good return, 2 verses 1, but they also provide aid for each other. Help, right? Not just labor, but help. If one of the companions gets in trouble, falls down, the other is there to help him up, to pick him up, literally pick him up, pick her up. But it's not about sin and restoration and that kind of thing. It's literally about what it says. So he's there to provide aid through this companionship. It's just a picture of two travelers on a rough road. That's really what it is. In verse 11, he speaks of the comfort that two provide. It says, furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm or have warmth. But how can one be warm alone? Right? This has nothing to do with marriage, has nothing to do with homosexuality, has nothing to do with those things. It has everything to do with being cold at night and trying to provide that comfort for each other in spite of the elements of the weather. And so if you're hiking Mount Everest, which is something that I plan never to do, when you hike Mount Everest, there may be a time where you have to gather around with other people to stay warm because your fire goes out, whatever might happen, but you need the warmth of other people. And that's what Solomon here is saying, that as he looks at all of these things under the sun, he can see a place where the two provide that comfort for each other through the warmth that they provide. So they provide a good return. They provide aid or help when someone falls down, two travelers on a rough road. And then they provide comfort in the place where there is discomfort, when the seasons are cold outside and you need that personal warmth. And then verse 12, another thing that companionship provides is security or protection. If you look at verse 12, it says, and if one can overpower him who is alone, which is generally possible, isn't it? If you're alone and a group of robbers see you walking by with all of your jewelry and fine gold and the necklaces and rings and everything, you can easily be overcome. But if you have a companion with you, it's less likely that they will try and rob you. So it says here that if one can overpower him who is alone, right, two can resist him. So if this one person's trying to take the one, he might be able to take him. But if there's two, then you have a better shot against the one. But then he says that a three-stranded cord is not easily broken. He says, look, this three-stranded cord, or these three strands, is not quickly torn apart. So it's more than just two, right? Because we talked about if two lie down together to keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? And one can overpower him as alone. Two can resist, but three is not easily overtaken. So the good thing here is that as Solomon is unpacking this, he's saying, oh, look, there is something about the idea of providing protection in a group. And again, all of this seems to go counter to isolationism and this idea of being isolationist and not having the help that you need and working hard to make sure that you're the one who's working, trying to provide for who? Just you, so hard that you can't even enjoy your labor. So then he goes on, remember, talks about companionship, the help, the good return, the help that is provided, the comfort that is provided, and then the protection that is provided. Not just with one extra person, but maybe even two companions along with you, because the two provides a three-stranded cord that is not easily overtaken or broken. So you see, what Solomon is saying here is that, what we've seen throughout the first couple of chapters here in Ecclesiastes is a bunch of vanity, right? We see this and we're saying, I don't understand why it seems like Solomon's talking negatively about everything, right? Everything is vanity. Everything is vanity. Here he's not saying everything is vanity. What he's saying here it's not about just vanity. Here it's about the idea that there are some positive things under the sun that are not vanity. And it has to do with companionship. Well, we see where he says being in isolation is very difficult, and it's a grievous task. And so then he says about the three-stranded cord, providing the protection, and then he moves on, and he switches gears quickly, because he goes from something not being vanity to where he provides a couple of what we call better than parables. And they're just small statements, but where I might say an apple is better than an orange, or a Chevrolet is better than a Ford. Now, I'm not saying it is or isn't. I don't want to get anybody upset who's got a Chevrolet or Ford, but they're both great to me. And so then we have in verse 13, he says, this poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. This is a very interesting parable, because Basically, he's giving us a picture of an older king, a king who has been in service longer than, this young lad who knows a lot of stuff. And while the king may know a lot of things, the king is no longer teachable. And I think what Solomon's saying here is, look, it doesn't matter how much you know. What matters is how much you grow. All right, let me say that again. It doesn't matter how much you know. It matters how much you grow. It doesn't matter how much you know if you don't grow. And that's really the crux of Solomon's instruction in verse 13. He says, look, this king, he no longer knows how to receive instruction, but the poor yet wise lad is better than that old and foolish king. Does that remind you of anyone? I mean, you can think back in the years that you've been alive and the years that you've been in church and been in other businesses. Have you ever known someone who has been too old to learn? They become unteachable. They think they know everything and they can't learn anything. This is where Solomon's getting at. He says, look, this young person over here, he's better than because he is teachable. He's better than because he is wise. He's better than because he still receives instruction. And then he goes on to explain it even a little more, and he says, for he has come out of prison, right? This is the poor yet wise lad, to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. So what Solomon's saying here is really that there are two kingdoms, right? There's the king kingdom, and then there's the poor kingdom, almost as if there were two social classes that Solomon noticed under the sun. Two kinds of people, as he noticed under the sun. One who was older and non-teachable, one who was younger, more wise, and was still teachable. And he says this younger lad came out of his kingdom and became king, even though he was poor in his kingdom. So what got him there? God got him there. But again, this is one of those better than parables. So that really the idea is, it's just a one big idea. Being teachable is better than not being teachable. Just remember this. It's not what you know as much as it is how much you grow. We have to always be in a state of growth and personal growth, spiritual growth in our lives, where we are moving forward with Christ. Well, we look as we keep going in verse 15, and he says once again, I've seen all the living under the sun thrown to the side of the second lad who replaces him or stands in his place. So this young, strapping lad who's very wise, still teachable, knows great things, he comes in and becomes king, and everybody, throngs of people, come to him and all but worship him. They come to his side. I want him to be king. I want to support his kingship. I want to support him because he's the king and he's smart. You old king over there, you're not teachable anymore. So you would think that what Solomon is saying here is that this young lad, this younger king, should be quite happy about that. But Solomon talks about a cycle of things that he sees happening. And it's a cycle of discontentment that occurs. And I'm just going to tell you, it happens everywhere. Discontentment happens in church. Discontentment happens in work. Discontentment happens in families. Discontentment happens in friendships. Discontentment happens with stuff. So you have a truck that you're driving around and you become discontented with it because of one thing or another. Some of you might become discontented with your wife because she's getting older. Well, guess what? You're getting older too. She's probably discontented with you. So then what? You're both discontented and you end up in counseling because you fail to be content in whatever situation God has placed you in that marriage that you said, hey, I'm making this covenant relationship between God and between my partner, between my spouse. So Solomon says this, there is no end to the people, all the people who all were before them. So I want you to think about this. A king's popularity is never permanent because people become discontented. They become discontent in their life. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them. And then even the ones who will come later, catch this, will not, and we're in verse 16, will not be happy with him. There will come a time in the life of a leader, in the life of a king, who once people loved, who then they will not love. What drew you to the king at first, as the king changes, so does your love for the king. That's why I'm thankful that Jesus is the same today, yesterday, and tomorrow. There is no change with him. But understand that you can become a king and throngs of people can run to you. But in verse 16 it says there's not even an end to all the people, but the people that came before, the people who come after, look, it says they will not be happy with him. Why is the average pastor stay at a church for 2, 3, maybe 4 years? Because people become discontented with the pastor. The pastor becomes discontented with the people. Is discontented a word? Or should it be just discontent? I'm just going to say the pastor becomes not content any longer. How about that? So when a member of the church becomes discontent and they leave the church, this is not something that should become a surprise to people inside of the church. Because this is a cyclical event that Solomon even talks about. Now I'm going to go just a little bit deeper with this and just say this, that I'm not specifically talking about Crossroads. I'm talking about every place who has leadership, every business, every church, whatever it may be. But the idea that people follow a person is most likely the most damaging thing that can happen in a church setting. And let me explain to you what I mean. I mean that if people are drawn to a church because of its pastor, because of a person, then they are drawn to the church for the wrong reason. People should be drawn to a church. People should be drawn to a place of worship because of Jesus. They should be drawn to a place of worship because of the Spirit that is tangible in that place of worship. Because once you put your hope and faith in a person, then you at some point will fall out with that person, and then something's got to go. So how does all this work? Because this is, verses 7 to 16. 10 verses that seem to have a different kind of twist in a couple of places. I think first we see this: isolation is not the best avenue in a person's life. 2, Solomon says that companionship is a good thing. And 3, that becoming a king does not really ensure that your popularity will be permanent. All of these have to do with relationships. Isolation, relationship with yourself. Companionship, your relationship with a few close friends. And then the king, his relationship with a whole community. So do you see how it spreads out from the isolated one, the single person unit, and then we have the friendship of 2 to 3 people, and then we have the larger unit of a community that has to deal with being content with its king. Every time I read Ecclesiastes, and every time I read through this book, the Bible, it continually amazes me the things that God shows me and helps me to understand and sort of brings out. And he reminds us here that don't think because everybody's on your side right now that everybody's going to be on your side tomorrow, the next day, or the next day, because what he says is that this too is vanity and striving after the wind. This too is useless, and it's like trying to chase the wind and grab it, because when you grab the wind, once you grab, there's nothing there. So then what do? I don't want to be the one that chases after the wind. Now what Solomon's saying here, he's not saying is that, look, it doesn't matter whether you're teachable or not, it's all vanity. That's not what he's saying. He said it's better to be teachable, and it's better to be wise than to be old and not teachable, because the young, wise, teachable one will excel and move from one social kingdom, one class, to another class and become king, where he will be, people will just love him. But once there, he has to deal with more than just his 3 friends. He has to deal with a whole community of people and to lead on a whole different level. The next week we're going to talk about, and God wasn't really mentioned here in chapter 4. It was not a real, it was not a chapter of, he really deals with the idea of work in chapter 4 and some of the oppression that people felt. But in chapter 5, we get back to the mention of God and what we should, how our attitude should be as we seek the Lord. So I look forward to sharing that with you next Wednesday. Let me remind you that we have our sign-up list online. It's at crossroadsflorence.org, and you can find that at the bottom of that page. There's a red button that you click, or you can hit the big blue picture at the top that says click here to register. You click it, and then you put your name and how many people are coming with you to our service on Sunday morning. We want to make sure we have chairs set up for you, and that that you'll be comfortable there. We'll make sure everything is clean and that we can worship together in truth and spirit on Sunday. Thanks again for being here. Let me pray for us tonight. Father, I thank you for the miracles that you do each day that we don't see and don't even recognize. I thank you that you care so much for us. And Lord, I thank you for what you do and continue to do in our lives, even in spite of ourselves. Lord, as we read this passage today, I know that there are people here who may be isolated, people here who understand the immense need for friendships, and God, even an understanding for what it takes to become a king and what it means to know and still grow. Lord, help us not to strive after the wind and to do vain things that are empty and useless. But God, help us to do things that matter to your kingdom. Lord, we do love you and we thank you for your Son, Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen. Now, before you turn off the computer, I want to just say a very special thank you to all of our veterans today. It's Veterans Day here in the United States, and I wrote a little thing about that. You should have gotten it this morning if you're part of the church. If not, just text me and I'll email it to you. But it's just a little thought about Veterans Day. But I do want to thank you, veterans who are part of the church, who are not part of the church, just tuning in. You may have family members who have been veterans. It is through their willingness to sacrifice that we can seek the Lord through worship and not be hindered by anything, but that we have the freedom to do that, and we're grateful, we'll forever be grateful to those who have sacrificed so much for us. And I just wanted to personally thank you, if that is you, for your sacrifice. So I look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Remember, personal reflection and worship starts at 10:15 to be followed by Mark Buxton, who will be speaking. He's from the Philippines, and he'll be speaking at 10:30. So don't forget to register, and we'll see you next time.